Hello channel and subscribers. My name is Adeline, and I'm here to share the story of what happened to my friend, Anna. Back then, we were very frightened because there were already a lot of rumors about a werewolf roaming around the farms. Now and then, we'd hear dogs fighting with something in the middle of the night. Sometimes even strange screams, unlike anything we'd ever heard. A terrible scream that chilled us to the bone. When we heard those screams coming from the woods, our grandparents or parents would quickly get up from bed to check the doors and windows, often grabbing coarse salt to sprinkle near the entrances, creating a protective barrier while they whispered a prayer. My grandmother would come to our beds and ask us to stay quiet, telling us that there was a werewolf outside, but that it would leave soon. Even today, I get chills when I think about it. Fear ran down our spines. I would pray for the night not to come, knowing it was very likely that werewolf would return. But one night during the June festivities, something far more sinister happened than the usual howls. That werewolf appeared on Anna's farm. It was the early 80s, and our farms were in a rural area near Cedar Hollow, a small town in northern Texas. Back then, we didn't have electricity yet, which made the nights even darker. Only a few years later did we get that luxury. Anna's farm was about half a mile from ours, and her family were our closest neighbors. Anna, the oldest of 5 siblings, was 16 and responsible for all the housework and looking after her siblings. Her father, the late John, was a traveling salesman and only came home occasionally, while her mother, Mrs. Patty, worked as a maid in a wealthy family in town. It was common for Anna and her siblings to be alone on that farm. Sometimes, my mother and I would go over to help with anything she needed. I remember my mom always warning her to lock the doors well because it was dangerous to be there at night without a man around. Back then, kitchens were separate from the house to keep the smoke from the wood stove outside. One afternoon, Anna started preparing dinner. Since it had rained a bit during the day, the wood was slightly damp, which made it take longer to light the stove. By then, night was already falling. Anna told us that her mother wouldn't be coming home that night, so she hurried to make soup because it would be quicker. The kitchen area, where the wood stove was about 300 feet from the house. Anna brought a lantern near the stove, and her younger siblings helped by fetching and carrying ingredients while she stirred the soup with a wooden spoon. The night was incredibly dark due to the rain, making it impossible to see anything in the distance. The silence was suddenly interrupted by the sound of chickens being stepped on. Anna was startled, looking around, but it was too dark to see anything beyond her nose. Her protective instincts kicked in when her younger brother, Jake, came over with a handful of okra. Anna told him, "Jake, there's something out here. I heard footsteps over there," pointing in the direction. "Go inside and start locking up the doors and windows. I'll be right behind you." Jake quickly gathered his siblings, who were playing near the door, took them to the bedroom, and began locking up the house. She hurriedly stirred the soup, trying to get it done quickly, glancing around every so often. She then heard footsteps, this time much closer. According to her, she suddenly noticed a very strong smell, like a pigsty mixed with rotting flesh. She immediately remembered that they said this was the scent of a werewolf. Fear took over my friend, and she abandoned the soup on the stove, running as fast as she could back to the house. She slammed the door shut with all her strength and asked Jake to help her reinforce the door lock. Just as they finished securing it, they heard footsteps approaching the house. These footsteps were so heavy it sounded like a horse trotting. The creature came up to the door and started pushing against it. Not knowing what else to do, they ran to their parents' bedroom and hid under the bed. At that exact moment, I remember that, back at our house, Mom was getting our beds ready for us to go to sleep. It was a tense, cold night when suddenly we began to hear children's screams, begging for help. Many voices. I'll never forget those screams. Mom said, "Those are Mrs. Patty's kids." Dad quickly grabbed his .38, checked that it was loaded, and said, "I'm going over there to see what's happening. John isn't home." As he stepped outside, holding a flashlight, we stayed by the door, listening to what was happening outside. I asked Mom what was going on, and she tried to calm me down, saying everything would be fine. Moments later, we heard 3 gunshots, followed by more screams. Mom, now desperate, said, "Oh God, I'm gonna see what's going on. You all stay here and lock the door." Shortly afterward, they returned, bringing my friend and her siblings. They were all crying. Mom gave everyone water with sugar to help calm them down. I asked them what had happened, and through sobs, she told us what took place minutes before my dad arrived. It's exactly what I described. The werewolf had been watching her while she was cooking. When she noticed its presence, she ran inside, and it started to break down the door, throwing itself against it. If the doors hadn't been made of solid wood back then, it would have surely gotten inside. Dad sat in the chair, his eyes wide in disbelief, saying, "We need to get out of here. I'm 59 years old, and I've never seen anything like that in my life. This is the end of times." From a distance, he'd seen it circling the house. The creature must have been around 7 feet tall, broad-chested with thin, twisted legs that bent backward. Its ears drooped, and its body was covered in thick fur. Even its head, which looked like that of a beast. It looked like a pig. The creature walked like a man, went over to the wood stove, and stirred the pot that was on it. I think it was trying to eat. I hid behind the avocado tree and fired 3 shots. I'm sure I didn't hit it, but it scared the thing. It dropped the pot and ran off into the woods. My mother told my dad, "It's the werewolf. Those screams we hear every night must be coming from him." Dad told us to go to bed while he stayed up, keeping watch for the rest of the night, afraid the werewolf might come back to attack us. Early in the morning, we went to Anna's house to check things out. The door was all busted up, everything near the wood stove was overturned, and there were footprints from the werewolf. They looked like a panther's paw print, but 4 or 5 times bigger. You could clearly see the claws embedded in the muddy ground. When Mrs. Patty came home from work and found out what happened to her children, Dad offered our house for them to stay in until Mr. John returned from his trip. For the next 2 nights, we still heard those terrifying screams from the werewolf. I call it a scream because it wasn't like a dog's howl. It was something else entirely. Dad could barely sleep anymore, too worried. When Mr. John returned and learned what had happened, he went to town to find a place for his family to live, and soon they moved out. Mom kept urging Dad to do the same because every night, the footprints the werewolf left on the ground showed it was getting closer to the farms. Soon enough, it would start attacking the animals, or, who knows, even the residents. Dad finally found a small house in town, and we moved there. The farm stayed abandoned for quite a while, until one day it was sold. I never returned to that area, and I believe Anna never did either. Even in town, we'd sometimes hear rumors about a big cat attacking livestock, but we knew it was really that werewolf. These rumors only died out in the early 90s. I never actually saw it myself, but just hearing those screams, and all that my family went through, still gives me chills to this day. So when the old-timers or hunters say they've seen a werewolf, I don't doubt it because I know it exists. I'm proof of that. I used to think it was just something my parents made up to scare us. But look what happened. This is a true story, experienced by my family and my friend Anna's family. Thank you. A family story. This time, it happened to my Uncle Valde, sometime between 1988 and 1990 when he was still dating his first wife. This is how it went. During those years, Uncle Valde was in a special time of his life, dating his first wife, who worked as a nurse in the only hospital in town. He had a set routine every day. After work, he'd head over to my grandparents' house, where he'd shower, have dinner, watch a bit of TV, and then, around 10 p.m., head to the hospital where his girlfriend was on the night shift. On calmer nights, she could give him some attention, and he'd spend a good amount of time chatting with her and her colleagues over coffee or yerba mate to chase away the chill of that mountain autumn, already a taste of the winter ahead. Our region here is mountainous, which makes it especially cold at that time of year. The hospital was about 7 blocks from my grandparents' house, and the road took him past City Hall and through the town's only square, a place that took on an eerie vibe at night. Ornamental plants and tall trees cast dark shadows, especially the crown of thorns hedges with their spiky branches that lined the flower beds. Stones scattered among the garden beds decorated the area, and the town's only library stood at the far end of the square, facing away from it. Behind the library were huge rocks that marked the transition between the square and the main alley, connecting the two streets, the street with City Hall and the parallel street above, which faced a hotel that still stands to this day. One night, as he was returning home from one of these late visits, something inexplicable happened. Uncle Valde had just left the hospital, and as he started crossing the square, he began to hear a strange sound as if something was dragging itself across the ground. He approached the large rocks behind the library, and as he rounded one of them, he came face to face with a disturbing creature. According to him, it looked like a man, but had disproportionately long arms and legs, with thick hair covering the upper part of its body. The creature was breathing heavily, almost panting, and drooling a thick, slimy goo. Uncle Valde, who always carried a .22 caliber revolver, froze with fear. Even so, his instinctive reaction was to run. As he glanced back, he saw that the creature was slowly standing up. He sprinted toward the street at the end of the alleyway by the square. At first, the dark figure didn't seem to follow immediately. Uncle Valde still had 5 blocks to go to reach home, and he kept running at full speed. But something made him look back again, and he was shocked to see the creature standing at the exact spot where he had just been, at the end of the main alley in front of the hotel. With his heart racing, he picked up his pace, and as he turned a corner by a newsstand near a school, he heard the unmistakable sound of hooves hitting the ground, like those of a horse. He ran faster, heading immediately for the corner on the upper street, parallel to where he had come from. Then, looking back, he spotted the creature near the newsstand, and to his amazement, 5 large dogs were advancing on it, barking furiously and making a deafening noise. Taking advantage of this distraction, Uncle Valde ran a bit further and finally reached home. He banged on the door, one of those old double-leaf doors, and woke up one of his brothers who, startled by the noise, quickly opened the top half. Uncle Valde practically threw himself inside, pale as a sheet and still gasping for breath, as he recounted to his brother what had happened. His brother, however, laughed it off, saying Valde must have been imagining things. But that night, the distant sound of dogs barking continued to echo through the town, reminding everyone that something inexplicable had truly happened. When faced with a werewolf, we feel defenseless, overwhelmed by the shock of seeing a creature that defies our imagination. Despite being armed, Uncle Valde's first reaction was to run and try to save his life. Fortunately, he managed to escape that night,